before I actually read my abstract, I want to start in a word of prayer. So if you guys will close your eyes and pray with me. Lord, thank you for giving us this opportunity that we can actually present these ideas that we've worked so hard on over a semester, and that you give us this time and the judges time to actually read and come up with questions so that we can dive deeper into these topics that we're talking about. And yeah, thank you for giving us this time. Amen. So my topic's about words, and words are one of those powerful things at a human's disposal, because words help us write down history. It helps us write down our ideas, and it helps us communicate with others. Without them, it would be extremely difficult to actually communicate with others and share these ideas and document what we have accomplished. So, understanding these words is extremely important. So, if I have an idea, or if I want to understand an idea, I will think about it, and you think in a language, right? So, I'm assuming everyone here thinks in English, right? And then, once I come up with the idea, I want to share that idea with others. So, to do that, I will communicate with others, and it goes on, and then they can share that idea. So, words affect everyone. No matter what you think, they will affect everyone. Right? Next, to understand, or when you're understanding words better, it influences how language changes, right? If I think of something and I change something about the word, it'll influence language later, because I can share that idea with others, and then it keeps going on, and it can influence the future of language. And when you're influencing the future of language, you're not only influencing the words itself, but you will also influence the structure of the words. Because the structure of the words is almost just as important as the words themselves. For instance, if I have a bike wheel, the handle of the bike, and the pedals of the bike, but they're not put together, it's just a bunch of pieces. But once I put them all together to make a bike, that's what makes everything make sense. And it's not just a pile of pieces anymore, it's an actual object that you can see and use, right? So if you know all these words, but you don't know how to structure the words, it's not very helpful. And that is why I believe that people should have a greater understanding of how words work. Thank you.
Xavier, this was a wonderful paper to read. And I enjoyed every bit of it. I am an individual that obviously, I'm a preacher, so I try to use words and use them effectively, and to do it with the proper, inflection, all of that. And so you did a wonderful job here. You mentioned here that there are certainties about words, and which would mean that there's plural, that there are several certainties. Would those certainties, just for clarification, would they be that words have and they will change in time? Or is it the have and will? Are those the certainties?
So just to clarify, I'm assuming you're talking about the part where words change over time, right? And there's some certainties about how they will change?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. So with the study of words, there's certain ideas like, I can't remember the exact, one example was the word gentleman, and I think I used it in this paper, right? So the word gentleman used to mean more of a title based on your social status, and then it changed more into how people perceive you. Like, you're a gentleman, and that's based off your actions. So as time changes, people will think of words differently, and you can make predictions about words based off those changes to see how they will change. So that's more the certainties that I'm talking about. Like, based off cultural changes, you can identify how a word will change.
Well, I thought that was interesting as well. Those two examples, the two words that you picked out, nice.
Nice.
That word changed to enrich the meaning in a positive sense. So nice originally meant silly, and then later on it had a pull towards respectability and virtue.
Mm-hmm.
So that one, the meaning enriched, whereas gentleman lost some of its original meaning, being a person or someone who owned land, the position, and now it's more of the subjective opinion of someone who's chivalrous.
Yeah.
So I found that was very interesting, that antithesis between enrich and lose. Overall, I really enjoyed this topic. I enjoy writing. I'm the Essentials tutor as well, so so I've been doing that for 3 years. So I think words and language are extremely important. This is a huge topic you took on.
Yes.
Just huge. There's so many different directions you could have gone with it. So I know that probably wasn't easy to narrow it down to some specific points. But I really liked your examples from current events that you brought in, and the research behind it, and you had a lot of variety of sentence structure and asking questions, which really made us pause and think. So those were some of the great things. Just from a grammar point of view, I prefer using third person plural, like we, in your narrative, rather than one does this and one should do that. The one made it a little harder to read, but overall, that's just a little thing. So, what inspired you to choose this topic? What drew you to it?
I think the thing that drew me to it was I saw this, like, it's this thing that says, and it's just some funny thing that I saw. It says, I work at a multi-million-dollar company and I manage their finances. And you think of that and you say, wow, you must have a really high position. Then their actual job position is just the cashier at McDonald's, right? But based off how you actually use the words, it influences your perception. So then I thought that was really interesting, so then I dug into it, and then I went into different avenues, but that was the original thing that I saw that I thought was really interesting.
Nice. I also liked the picture you painted in your opener. It's like a little mini story about your experience, and it transitioned very nicely into your first paragraph, that stories are a powerful tool to capture someone's attention. So I like that link. So it's interesting how words change. Oh, okay. On page 2, when objective truth gets torn down and replaced with subjective claims, it can lead to a whole bunch of problems where truth can be defined by a person and not defined by the facts. Mm-hmm. So what are some of these problems that can happen when objective truth is torn down and replaced with subjective claims?
Well, objective truth is something that is true no matter what I think, no matter what you think, or no matter what anyone else thinks. And if we let that change, right? So if a word means something that is objectively true, and we let it shift to something that can be more subjective, it can ruin people's perception of certain things, because now you think, oh, because this word was considered objective and now it's more considered subjective, it can hurt other words that are still considered objective, but now they could have an argument that, oh, this word maybe is more subjective than objective, and then it'll hurt the integrity of other words. Or maybe the word should have stayed objective and should not have moved into the area where people thought it's more subjective, right? So.
Go ahead.
So Xavier, can I have you go into that? So when is it okay for it to move from that objective to subjective? For example, even in your illustration of gentlemen, mm-hmm. it became more of a subjective truth of kind of how you're viewing that person, rather than the objective nature of they owned land, and it was very, very, very factual. I actually liked the way it moved as well. But where does that line, is that a problem when it always goes from objective to then subjective?
I don't think in any of my research I found a point where it is good for a word to go from from objective to a subjective. So in my research, I did not find any point where it is good for a word to go to a subjective truth instead of staying as an objective truth. I think instead, people should try to use a word that already exists as a subjective truth or create a new word for it, right? Because then you muddle the idea of how words will change.
This kind of leads into the example you had about Judge Jackson refusing to define woman in the Supreme Court hearings. And your resulting concern, it's harmful because now, how will this affect our legal system? Will people change definitions to suit their needs? So maybe you can talk about that example a little bit, because I thought that was really interesting about that move from objective to subjective.
Yeah, so you can see how, if you look just maybe 50 years back, if I said the word woman, would there be any controversial about what I meant, right? There probably wouldn't be. But now when I say the word woman, there is controversy surrounding the word about what it actually means. And when this happens, like for instance, Judge Jackson was considered the first black woman to be elected onto the Supreme Court, right? But at the same time, she was not willing to define what the word woman is. And if someone who is going into this like position of power cannot define like such a word that was considered simple, it says a lot about like how the word itself has been changing over time, right? So if like when we change certain things, it makes things unclear, which then has problems come up because of that, because of the unclarity, and it can lead to more problems.
Yeah. So you had said women's rights, we'll use a genetic definition of the word woman, right? Because it's important to look at the genetic definition, but trans woman states that an adult who's assigned a male at birth, but they identify as a female. So in that case, woman has a completely subjective meaning, completely different meaning. So I don't know. I'm curious, what do we do about situations like this where kind of the same side of the aisle is using a word in two different ways to suit whatever agenda they're trying to push? Is there anything we can do about that?
I think that is a very big problem, and the problem lies more with how people perceive truth. If you'll hear people say, "That's my truth," or "You can have your truth and I can have my truth," right? And when that gets muddled and stuff, it goes into our society and changes certain things, and it has now affected our speech and our words. So I think making sure people understand the importance of having objective truth and subjective truth and making sure they stay separate, it would be the first step in doing something like that, or in fixing that sort of problem.
Sure. I really like that follow-up question because we're here for you. I mean, we're in your corner, and these are questions like if you were to, let's say you were to go into debate for a living or public speaking for a living, these are the types of questions that you're going to face. And I know that your paper is on just words, not necessarily objective and relative and subjective truth. But I thought it was very bold for you to take on this topic, but I think you logically did a really good job with the argument. But I have a question for you, because you mentioned how words can change. You've used a few examples of them. So nice and then how it has changed. Where that became subjective, when it was objective, that's not the question. Some would say that it was at its original meaning, and then now it's become somewhat subjective. But since words can change, can the word woman change? Because the premise is that words change over time and they change over meaning. I love what you said at the beginning. When you influence words, you influence the structure of society.
Mm-hmm.
So can that word change? If we're saying that words can change, is it okay for the word woman to change?
I think that if you want to change a word, there has to be an extremely good reason for the change. So if you're changing the word because you think that the current word is somewhat harmful, then maybe the word should be changed. But if you want to change the word because you want to change opinions, right? Because ideas and words are almost the exact same thing, because the ideas in my head, I will transfer them into words so that I can share with other people. So if I want to influence other people, I will have to change words, and by changing words, now you influence other people. So I think in the case of the word woman, it should stay with its biological definition, but I do see why that's an extremely big topic to cover, right? So,
but what you did put in there was logical. Okay.
thank you.
So I'm going to I asked this question earlier. How do you think a classical education has helped you with this topic? So, for example, I know that in your outline that you're basing this thesis on, there's a section on definition, right? Defining your terms. So what do you think of classical education, that approach, how is that helpful to finding that absolute truth or defining things, defining words?
One thing that I really found helpful, which was in essentials, was how they had the sentence, chart A was all sentence structures and different things. You have the different types of sentences you can have, and you have the different structures you can have. And understanding that there are these structures and why these structures work the way they are, and why if you don't use these structures, you will cause confusion, helps paint a really good picture of oh, these aren't here just because some person made them up just to make it harder to communicate. They're here because it makes it easier for other people to actually understand you when you use these types of structures. And then once you get used to using those structures, you have more tools at your disposal to actually share these ideas that you have with other people. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, and I would just add that I think you've done this with debate. One of your first steps is to define your terms and make sure everyone's on the same page, everyone's in agreement about what our key terms are. Because you can't argue something if you have one definition of a word and they have another definition, you can't argue, right? You have to agree on your terms. And so I think that's something that's been very valuable with your debate strand throughout Challenge. Let's see.
In your research for this topic, did you find that some of what you found refuted your ultimate claims here? Did they poke any holes in maybe your thinking or your stance on this?
So I'm assuming that you're saying when I was researching, was there anything that I found that was contradictory to what I actually wrote in the paper?
Yeah, or your thinking. Did it push against you?
There's definitely things that when I was researching, I'm oh, that's really interesting. I never thought of it that way. Or oh, that's the reason why something is that way. But I don't know if necessarily there was anything that I was oh, that changed my thinking, because I came at it more of the perspective of what can I learn, and I didn't have a super defined definition of what I was going in looking for. So I don't think that when I was actually researching, there was any point where I could see something I was like, oh, that changed how I view it. Just based off what I used to view, because I didn't have a specific viewpoint before that.
Sure, you had made a reference that words are primarily the only way to communicate, and then we all were thinking sign language. You did a great job with that, because that's exactly what we were thinking when we were reading that. How about small children that don't have any correlation with words yet, and they're able to communicate, with a parent, although it might just be screaming or something, but they're able to communicate something that they want? Or do you feel that art might also communicate in a way that would not include words? I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
That was something that I did research into but didn't actually put into the paper, was like art and music, right? They're forms of expression that do not have anything to do with words, right? Or like music as in like the instrumental kind, not the vocal kind. And how sometimes there are like things that we're thinking of that cannot be expressed in words, so sometimes people will use like art or the instrumental kind of music to express it. But yeah, that was something that I did find that was very interesting.
Two of the refutations that you had were the following. People might say that knowing less can be easier sometimes. And the third one was focusing too much on learning can harm relationships. So I was a little confused, and maybe you can clarify this. Are you arguing that learning is the goal, or better understanding words and language itself? Because when you're talking about knowing less, if people are saying knowing less can be easier, that's not really talking about words specifically, it's talking about knowledge in general. And same thing with focusing too much on learning can harm relationships. It's talking about learning rather than words in general. So maybe you can clarify that for me, how that...
Yeah.
Are you really talking about words or just learning in general with those refutations?
I think that maybe I should have worded it differently. But when I forget, you said there was learning and then there was also... Knowing
less can be easier sometimes was one refutation, and then focusing too much on learning can harm relationships. It's page 11.
Yeah, sorry. You used a word before learning that I like, but I can't remember the word. Okay. But the focus, or I think the idea that I was trying to convey was when people, so I'm just going to go to the first one first, right? Knowing less is sometimes easier, right? Mm-hmm. But the reason that is because people don't want to have to process the information. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's better in the long run for you to actually know these kind of things than just to push it off and say, I don't want to learn about it. Because, like, if something happens, I'm just going to use an example. If something happens to an animal and one of their limbs, and their limb needs to be cut off to save the rest of the body, it's really hard to do it. Like, the animal is going to be like, why are you doing this to me? But you still have to cut the arm or the limb off to save the actual animal. So sometimes you have to actually go out and try to learn more about words. Because if I use this example in the paper, but for instance, in North Korea, they don't teach the word for, I forget which word I used, but they don't teach them that they're under control, right? Mm-hmm. Because if they knew that they were under control, you could theoretically they would theoretically try to make resistance so that they could overturn the government. But by not teaching them that they are being controlled, they don't ever come up with the idea that they are. So sometimes, yes, knowing less can be easier, but it's also more ignorant, right? Because you don't know about these ideas, and maybe these ideas are very important, but you won't ever know until you actually go ahead and try to learn them. Then what was the second part of your question?
Well, they were related. It was just, is your focus, so when you talk about knowing less or focusing too much on learning can harm relationships, it just seemed like you were broadening the topic a lot rather than focusing specifically on words, because all of learning, right, is huge versus words is a more specific, the order of words or the grammar or the ideas conveyed by words. So I was just trying to clarify that.
Xavier, in your first premise, your question of who will this affect, I believe you did a wonderful job with connecting words with us individually. Like, it affects us first, the ones that are going to use the words. So you did a great job with connecting words with our mind, because we think in words. And you made the statement, when one changes how one employs words, it also changes how one might think. This is because people think in words. I thought that was a wonderful, thought-provoking statement. And that caused me to just pause and to think there is validity even deeper than I already thought with this topic, because we are thinking, well, we should be at least, far more than we're speaking. And that is the case. We're constantly thinking. And we're thinking in words.
Yeah.
And the more that you're saying, the more we learn, just the better I think it will become. And so I just want to thank you for that. It's a great point.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up.
In your policy section, you say, what should we do to further our understanding of words? The first and most important thing to do is get oneself into the right mindset to learn. So what is the right mindset to learn? And you follow that up with, he needs to find what works best for him. So what sort of a mindset do we need to be in?
I think if you want to actually learn, you actually have to be more of an open mindset, because if I go into a situation and I come in with a closed mindset, anything that's being told to me or I'm trying to learn is just going to hit closed doors, and it's just going to bounce back. And I'm never going to let it actually go in and I'm never going to let it plant the seeds so that it actually can grow into something. So you have to go into it with an open mindset. I think that's one of the most important things.
So at the very end, you have some great questions, very thought-provoking questions. So I'm going to ask you one of the questions that you raised. How will you take control over your ideas, words, and communication skills? What will you do to improve these areas? So looking for specifics here, because the idea of we need a greater understanding, that is a little bit subjective, right? What is greater? It's not very objective. So maybe you can give me some more specifics. How are you going to take control over this?
One way that you can do this, I think I mentioned this earlier, but if more people that just read, it could be actual historical or fiction, but they tend to understand others better. And I think the reason that they stated was they're able to see more, because for instance, if I'm stating a fictional novel, right, there's ideas that the writer had that don't even exist in the real world, but then when the reader is able to visualize that, and actually it broadens the area of what they can understand. So then when I listen to someone else and I'm having a conversation with them, they're trained better so that they have a more open mindset so that they can actually visualize what the actual person is saying, and it helps them in that way. So.
Yeah, I liked that focus on how reading can make us more empathetic and understand the views of others, and also deep reading. I think you had a little research on that too.
You had referenced how languages change based on society's needs. And we live in a very just kind of fluid society right now. When you were writing this paper, when you were researching this paper, did you in any way foresee how you might go further into this topic of using it, maybe even beyond you graduate, how you can really impact society?
So I just want to clarify, based off what I was reading, was there anything that I saw that was like, oh, if I share this with people or if I do something about it, it could impact society?
No, I mean, like, so words change because of societal needs.
Mhm.
And you did reference that hopefully it's for a positive change, right? We're seeing some things for a negative change, how words are changing, you use woman, things like that. But did you, and this is just personal, not necessarily in your paper, did you, as you're researching this and writing it, did you ever think, wow, maybe this study has sparked maybe something more in you to want to advocate?
So more of a personal level.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there are times where if I don't have anything to do, sometimes I'll just look up certain things about, like, trying to learn more about how certain things work. So for instance, one thing that was interesting that I just learned recently was when people get hurt, you'll often hear them swear, right? And the reason for that, well, if you look at other animals, the animals will have certain sounds for different things. So let's use the example of a monkey. And if a monkey sees a snake, it'll use a guttural sound, a short guttural sound that signifies snake. So all the monkeys know that there's a snake nearby or something crawling in the grass. It might not be a snake specifically, but then the monkeys know. Then they have one for like maybe a cat. So they will use another guttural sound for the word cat or something that can climb up the tree. So when they see the cat or the snake, they'll use the other sound depending on which animal it is. And then the monkeys know what to do. And that uses a certain part of the brain. And when we look at when people get hurt and they use swear words, they use the same part of the brain that the monkeys were using to use the swear words. And something that's interesting about swear words is you'll notice that they're normally very short, right? They're like one syllable, and they're really easy to like say. So when someone gets hurt or something happens, they'll instantly use that word because those words are associated with that part of the brain.
So basically what I was saying, we need men like you. That's like it's like a passion for this going forward because society is so changing, which means words are going to be rapidly changing. So I was ultimately saying, good job.
Thank you.
So this is right after you talk about in North Korea, they withheld its citizens from learning the word oppressed.
That's the word,
That was the word. So that the North Koreans didn't even know they were oppressed because they had no concept of the word. And that allowed the government to control the ideas of people. And then you say because the people don't know any better, they're more easily deceived. This lets large powers have control over their lives. But if one understands that by controlling a language, one can also control one's own thoughts, it can help one perceive and catch when someone is trying to deceive them. So how do we control our language or our thoughts so we're not deceived on a personal level? How can we do that to avoid being deceived?
So I think a lot of times, like sometimes when you look at social media, you'll see something and all of a sudden something that you'd never had an opinion about, you will all of a sudden have a very strong opinion about it just because of something that you read, right? And it's understanding that maybe I shouldn't just read something and all of a sudden have a very strong opinion about it, but should actually look into it and do a little bit of research so I actually know something about the topic and not just taking the word of someone who just posted something and something like that. So it's actually looking deeper into the subject and not just taking someone's word for it that maybe isn't exactly an expert, or maybe they even misunderstood an expert and is now sharing this information.
Totally agree. Page 4, so I'm flipping around. As one ages, so this is talking about who does this affect. As one ages and matures, sometimes it's easy to pretend that one knows all he needs to know about a subject. Abolish this idea. Once one has cleared this hurdle, they can actually learn. So do you think it's harder to learn or change one's habits the older you get? And why do you think that is, if so?
I think it depends on how you mature over time, right? If once you get to a certain age and you think, oh, okay, now I've gone into this age, I know everything, or it can come from pride, right? It's not wanting to admit to others that you don't know something about something. And then you convince yourself that you do know something about the subject, and then you don't want to hear others' opinions about it because of your own pride. And I think that's one of the big areas where people's pride affects actually wanting to listen to other people.
So do we get more prideful as we get older?
I think that over time, as you do gain more knowledge, you do think that you have everything. And if you want to, you can totally go on living like you already know everything, but by actually understanding that you don't know everything and that there is more for you to learn, you're able to grow more.
Totally agree. Yeah, pride is at the root.
Xavier, one of my greatest takeaways from your paper was that we ought to be advocates for words, because I believe you laid it out beautifully that our society is changing, and the only way we can affect our thinking and affect those around us is to have a proper understanding of how words are used. And so I want to thank you for that. You did a good job.
Thank you.
Related to that, what do you think was the most valuable thing you learned about this topic?
The most valuable thing I learned?
What could you walk away with?
I think the most important thing that I'm going to walk away with after writing this is that there's always more to learn, and you should actively try to go ahead and try to learn it for yourself, so that someone else doesn't go ahead and understand it and then try to teach it to you yourself. You actively go and try to find out more about it.
And that's time. Congratulations.